can go again. Don't fall behind. Say don't be late. Destination heaven. Stay alive. Now you and me. We're going to have fun. Say, blast off.
When those words rang out to me on a sunny morning in July 1991, it marked a shift in the gaming landscape for Sega and Nintendo. Something special had happened. I had taken the day off school. Bad stomach. Moving on. I plugged in this cart that I had seen pictures of in Mean Machines and other magazines. It was a long time coming, but nothing had prepared us for Sega's latest and by far most successful and recognised mascot. Now we have a spiritual successor to those hallowed 90s days to dive into. I would be remiss to not look back at just what an impact the Blue Hedgehog made to the Megadrive, Sega and gaming overall. To understand this, we need to go back to the future. Nintendo still dominated the console market, fresh from rescuing it after Atari saw fit to flush it down the toilet in the same decade. The Nintendo Entertainment System, or NES, was nothing short of a revelation, becoming a household lover in Japan, known as the Famicom, and America alike, whilst also being a decent success here in Europe. But another Japanese company also had aspirations of becoming king of the home gaming market. And with their third try, the Master System, it managed to create a foothold in the market thanks to the popularity it gained here and Brazil. Sega were on the radar, but not in the same race at this point. Second they may have been, but the gap was wide. Now when you have nothing to lose, then the risk and reward gamble gives you much better odds. Aware that NEC had started to nibble at its heels with the PC Engine, becoming the first 16-bit console to hit the market in Japan the year before. But Sega had its vast arcade heritage and hardware to lean upon, starting with the Master System, but the next console would be based on far more powerful hardware in the System 16 board that was home to many great arcade hits from Altered Beast, Golden Axe, Shinobi, Alien Syndrome and many others. It was known for its deep colours, chunky sprites and screen-filling effects. The Megadrive was a cut-down version of that in a sexy design, stylish logo, and it tricked many with its CD-ROM-like design, but it was a true ROM-based cartridge system. It was far more powerful than the PC Engine, housing a true 16-bit CPU in the prevalent Motorola 68000. Faster movement, larger and greater sprites, better sound, more bandwidth, the list goes on. But it never managed to topple the Engine in Japan, something they learned quickly of, and as such hurried to launch the Megadrive in 1989 across North America and Europe and Australia in 1990. It managed to beat NEC to market and never looked back. The renamed TurboGrafx 16 was a decent runner in the console war outside of its home territory. I got my hands on my first Megadrive from their Japanese import in 1989, and I remember playing Altered Beast and being blown away at just how close it was to the arcade release. But even now, in late 1990, the spokesman for the Megadrive was still Alex Kidd. I mean, who in their right mind puts this in a fight with Mario? Now, I've seen unfair fights happen, but this was just suicide. Then again, any kid that can smash a car with his bare fists, you have to have a healthy fear of. Now luck would have it, Sega had not been completely blind to this comedy act and saw fit to drop the curtain with haste. Developed under the codename Defeat Mario, the replacement was far better suited to the task at hand. It may have taken over 3 years from the Megadrive's launch, but the spiky blue hedgehog sped his way into the hearts and homes of gamers across the globe, helped by hoofing Altered Beast out as the packing game, and in no time became the head of the blue brand. Mario truly had a rival, the likes of which had never been seen before. Faster, smoother, brighter, his goal was clear. Brimmed with attitude, that oh-so-90s finger wag was as much at the player as the competition. Don't even try. Became the bedrock for the system's fight against the Super Nintendo. Before this point, the world was convinced the SNES was head and shoulders above the Genesis in terms of visual performance, rotation, and cartoon-like colours. Yuji Naka's programming skills carried over from his incredible Ghouls and Ghosts arcade port, rewriting the rulebook on just what the 16-bit Megadrive could deliver. It was without doubt the fastest game seen on any home format. But beyond that, it delivered full-screen rotation, just to show the SNES no longer held this exclusively. Levels were huge both horizontally and vertically, allowing the game's mix of speed, backtracking and exploration to shine. Some levels, like the opening and iconic Green Hill Zone, became the target for speedruns, leaving Mario in the dust, with Sonic's slowest speed being the same as the Red Plumber's fastest. The first stage could be completed in under 30 seconds. I never got a perfect 24-second run, but I spent much time trying. The variation of vast height, secret sections, boss battles, all controlled with a single button and 4 directions. It was the best platformer on the system and one of the greatest ever made. It managed that very rare trait of mixing speed, skill and simplicity into a stylish and technically pioneering title. Many programmers at the time could not believe what the team had achieved with the machine. Much of this was possible due to the faster 68,000 CPU, wider internal and external data bus, and of course its blitter functions, or DMA, direct memory access, which became more widely known and marketed as blast processing once it was utilised heavily in the sequel. This was the precursor to both modern DMA circuits and GPUs, enabling fast bit shifting, merging and blitting. Hence the name, moving and merging memory from one block to another without the need of wasting CPU cycles, although it could hog the bus exclusively while this happened. It was made famous on the Commodore Amiga as they patented the name and used it successfully on many titles within that machine's Agnes, Denise and Paula chipset. The arcade-inspired hardware of the Megadrive made it even more of a potent sprite-shifting beast. Up to 80 hardware sprites could be thrown over and under the dual-scrolling planes. With its raster line changes, it could deliver depth effects like parallax scrolling, normally associated with arcades, although the Amiga was also known as a parallax pushing beast. By manipulating the vertical rows and at times horizontal columns of the display, causing interrupts between each raster line as it is drawn to the screen via the electron beam. This could be used to swap the palettes to increase the maximum possible on screen, or to scroll the image as it was drawn. Now, this technique allowed many special effects such as the depth to multiple layers of scrolling, water-light wave filters and much more. It had some limits, but combined with the dual plane backdrops it could handle in hardware, it gave the Sega machine a huge benefit over other previous machines. This was indeed one of the standout features of the 16-bit era. The water surface you see here in Sonic is a great example of it in action, mixed with the dual layer foreground and background of the mountains, not to be confused with this raster movement. The sense of scale was convincing and impressive. The maximising of every one of its 76,000 pixels constructed from its 320 by 240 resolution, with a majestic grace, large sprites, it could still fill the screen with rich and varied tile map backdrops, all zipping across the screen at a blistering 50 or 60 FPS, but it felt about 4 times faster. Scarily, the game was even faster during development, but they slowed it down based on playtest feedback. Now, so popular was the title that Sonic even managed to travel back into the 8-bit Master System world, a new game designed from the ground up to better fit the hardware it may have been. Single backgrounds and sprite planes, far more barren zones, smaller sprites, a much slower pace and no ability to recollect your fallen rings due to sprite limits. It made the game tougher. Now, although the expense was obvious, this was still Sonic on 8-bit, and that included the Game Gear, which helped sell that system and eat through batteries like no tomorrow. It cemented him as the new Sega darling across all the platforms they had, but the Megadrive was his true home and birth. Overnight, Mario games now seemed rather sedate, slow, and almost boring compared to this. The lines had been drawn. A true titanic struggle was about to unfold on the playgrounds across the world. Xbox versus PlayStation, it's a footnote to this. Begun. The console wars have.
Look at these radical colors, huh?
Wow, Sonic's fast too.
No, over here.
I like Genesis, and it costs a lot less.
Wait, kid, that game
I'll
there.
take Sonic and Genesis.
I knew that.
Sonic the Hedgehog. More action, more speed. Sega Genesis, it's a whole lot more for less.
The second game released 1 year later and yet again tore up the rulebook, premiering the splits between Sega Japan and Sega America perfectly. Nakasan quit Sega over disagreements with many things, thanks to one Mark Cerny who worked for Sega at the time and his new STI. No, not an embarrassing infection, but the Sega Technical Institute division. He snapped him up and fellow designer Yasuhara to begin work on his next adventure. A collaboration between East and West became one of many firsts. The other being Sonic Tuesday. A simultaneous worldwide launch was another. Well, within the same week at least. The fastest hero in the world would not let jet lag or the equator stand between him and world domination. Before this point, games came out kind of when they did. No set launch date and sometimes years between regions. But once this vast coordinated effort got media attention, huge sales, it became the industry standard ever since. And still many new titles launch on a Tuesday even today. And you have Sonic to thank for that. Now, not only was the launch faster than anything else, the game was as well. Also one of the few titles to make use of the console's high-res mode in the split-screen option. That notorious flicker from its Interlace 2 mode, offering up 8x16 tiles, it stretched the vertical resolution to 480 and still pushed both Sonic and his new companion Tails with its new split-screen 2-player co-op around at 60 FPS. It pioneered as much if not more than the first and still sits as one of my personal favourites in the series. A new 3D bonus stage was added that had the pair race down a half-pipe with real polygons collecting rings. Another trick using compressed pre-rendered video, much like Silpede's movie backdrops. You simply move around to collect the overlaid sprite rings across the film backdrop. Simple, but effective. It pushed even more action on screen, more effects, sprites and movement, and was the game that started the whole blast processing PR spin that really rolled Nintendo, with them claiming it was all false, which it was not. But as I said, the console wars affected companies and customers alike at the time. Even though the SNES could and did use DMA within its architecture, like many functions of the machine, it was not as fast or as wide. But what is this blitzing I keep referring to? Well, it's very simple. And Sonic Mania itself references the technique perfectly, and I'm sure on purpose in the game. It allows a background tile or tiles to be updated within another bitmapped image, which is as simple as it sounds. So blitzing is really a two-step process on the target. You take an outline of your intended source sprite, and this is your mask. This is then stomped over the destination, and all pixels that we want to show data we mark a single bit, thus a 0 for black, just as you see here with Sonic and Tails behind the glass. There are cutouts from the background that match up to those black pixels perfectly. All the white ones do not impact the image at all. Then the sprite image is again blitted over the same locations in the second pass and all over the map, and again white areas are ignored and only non-white areas override the destination, which will of course match the previous stomped mask. The result is a clean display of the sprite over the background. Now of course there are other options that can be used in these techniques, which include doing the reverse and fixing the background if you have so many sprites or objects to blitz all over the screen. Now blitzing like this differs from hardware sprites, as these all happen over a shared block of memory. Hardware sprites, mind, have their own cache and as a result can move over the image as needed without the need to worry about the background. Sprites are of course much faster but are limited by the amount it can handle, e.g. the Megadrive could draw approximately 16 to 20 per line depending on its output resolution mode. Blitzing or DMA is only restricted by space or bandwidth. Having both gave the team the choice to use each as needed, with my assumption that the rings are coming from this technique of blitzing, and this is why they can cause slowdown when they happen, but you don't get flickering, which is common of the sprite technique. Now many machines use blitter chips such as the Amiga and the Atari Jaguar to great effect, and they were a great tool in the game maker's arsenal. It does need to be taken into account just how much of a leap up in hardware use, colours, speed and lack of any obvious errors or regular slowdown the game had. Sonic, like the first, raised the bar yet again that all would follow. You can chart games and the craze for a distinguishable mascot over two distinct periods. Before Sonic and after. Many tried to create the same cool, edgy vibe, but few managed to achieve it, and none came close to equaling him. He burned a trail that all followed, but none kept up. The second title followed the first by also jumping back onto the Master System. It was another game made from the ground up, and it still ran and performed very well, giving those hanging on to 8-bit machines something else to enjoy.
It's Mega World.
Now, the Megadrive was famous for many things. One of those was the sheer quantity of add-ons, peripherals and augments it would receive to extend its lifespan and reach. One of the most successful was the Mega CD, which came on the back of the FMV craze that swept the world in the early to mid-90s. Another pioneer in Night Trap was its most infamous title. But it wasn't all about grainy, compressed, chuggy video that you squinted at, pretending you could make out the details. Real games could also thrive on this new expanded world, and Sonic was not wasting time.
You with me, Control? We're going in.
A year after 2, and indeed many of its elements had been intended for the second title, including its core time travel skill, his next outing was ready. Tails was gone, but the red-shoed wonder brought his own DeLorean. Thanks to dotted past or future signposts and an 88 miles per hour was reached, Sonic could travel to altered versions of each stage that offered up new paths, enemies and challenges. A full anime intro was included, and awesome hip-hop theme. The game's music was improved due to the space on the disc, and now Sega had its own Mode 7 effect, thanks to the machine's incorporated ASIC, offering up superscalar functions that enabled not just backgrounds but sprites also that could be scaled and rotated. This was used in the new bonus stages of the game. Although far from smooth, it was a treat and showed off points of the hardware that wasn't possible on the standard Megadrive. Arguably, its best use came from Batman Returns' exclusive Batmobile sections. Still had the chance to show off the new dedicated distortion hardware of mine, something absent from its later failed add-on in the 32X. Now, as music was a key element in the series, with the first 2 games using Japanese band member Nakamura-san, the CD options contained a mixture of PCM sequence tracks and CD tunes, with each time zone having its own. But most loved is the theme tunes, and who can forget karaoke classics in Toot Toot Sonic Warrior, where you can play the Guess the Lyric game.
You are what you need out of 10. You've got the power to save the land.
Take a little chance, slip on through. We got smart no matter what you do. You gotta do for you.
The power is in your mind to seek the planet to conquer Gaia. Sonic royalty, this is a
It would take a 2-part release the following year to introduce more new characters in the 3rd and 4th titles, with his very own game that pioneered plug-through action, allowing Knuckles to enjoy the delights of the 3rd game as was intended from the start. Split up due to time and cartridge size constraints, but also remarkably, the 2nd title could also be refreshed with the wall-crawling antics and gliding skills of the Echidna. Turning the trademark spikes into cool dreadlocks, he was well received, with him being an antagonist to Sonic. It made him far more interesting. Now, the 2 games added the extra skills, which meant part of the new zones could only be accessed with his new skills. Level obstacles and traversal was added. Now, going back to Sonic 2 and playing the same game with this new hero was also a real marketing boom, which genuinely felt worthwhile and exciting. Sadly, Sonic fared with a much simpler but still edgy rebuttal for your attempts at rewriting history. Now, technically they had maximised the console at this point. No scaling hardware like the CD release meant that staggered animation effects and pseudo 3D was used to embellish the technical side of the end of chapter fight. This was not the end of Sonic & Co.'s appearances though on the Megadrive, or indeed on later Sega hardware. Knuckles went all chaos on us, the popular pinball spin-off came, and Saturn players had a quasi-kart racing style 3D adventure, and although it was very impressive from a technical standpoint, as it utilised the split VDP displays of the machine much better than most, offering up a decent 3D performance, true transparency effects by merging the VDP1 of the polygons with VDP2, but actually having VDP2 over 1. Therefore, the polygons blend into each other with true transparency and no dithering, which was a limitation of the VDP1 hardware. It feels out of your control most of the time and epitomises the varied mix of 3D incarnations we have got ever since. Now, aside a much wanted but never delivered true Saturn adventure, he has appeared on the 8-bit Master System with a ground up new game to the final machine from Sega in Sonic Adventure. Not a bad game, but it, like R, demonstrated the difficulties many teams had with shifting games into this new 3D world. One that was so blisteringly fast and precise as Sonic suffered more than most. Although visually very impressive, the lower frame rates, lacking controls and woeful camera made it a chore to play at times, with its plot starting the trend of over-complexity and dark descent. The death of its hardware platform could still not stop the Blue Streak mine. From mobile, 360, PS3, PC and even a partially complete C64, Amiga and Atari ST release that never saw the light of day, the years have passed, but his speed and Eggman battles have raged on unabated. We had one of the best recent Sonic games in generation on last-gen machines. It managed to capture much of the feel and style from the iconic originals, but mixed in a 3D twist on the 2D game that worked even better than the Mega CD or Dreamcast adventure games. Although performance issues persisted, it was a game that I enjoyed more than any that had come throughout this generation prior. One of the things consistent from the shift into 3D was the dip to the frame rate. The Megadrive up to this point had all been 50 or 60 Hz titles, dependent on the region, and they held that locked at all times. The only exception to that was on the Mega CD, where the bonus stages did dip down to around 16 or 17 frames per second. Now essentially this is the same as the stuff I covered on the virtual racing title. They do interleave their update between the background, the actual rotation section and the sprites, so essentially it is still updating at 50 Hz, but when you're playing the game, because the actual geometry or the level itself doesn't move the floor, it is actually updating at 17 frames, which is why it feels slower. Now this continued throughout the generation. Once we got to 3D titles on the Saturn, it ran at 25 frames per second on both Sonic R and Sonic Jam. Even though they are locked and smooth at that frame rate, that's as fast as they went. And this continued up to and including Sonic Generations. Essentially it holds the frame rate above 30, it hits the 33 millisecond target all the time, but every 8th frame it skips into the 16 millisecond point, and this causes an average of around 32 to 33. This means that the game can feel inconsistent and a little jittery, even though it's not. The other issue is they don't update the world geometry as smooth and as evenly as they should, so to keep the speed going it actually skips large chunks of frames, and that makes the movement feel even worse over and above the frame rate, which generally holds the 30 target 99% of the time.
Hold down the square button for a boost of speed. Once the boost gauge on the lower left is empty, you can no longer use boost. Defeat enemies or collect points to refill the boost gauge.
It was around this time that the community was becoming dissatisfied with the relatively poor showing from Sega on the Sonic front, and it took some hardcore fans, programming skills, artistic flair and imagination to craft their own engine focused on emulating these older bitmap shifting raster fueled delights within the modern day polygon created and texture mapped verts. The result was the imaginatively titled Retro Engine, and after a remake of Sonic CD and the first two titles, they were granted the reins to make a brand new Sonic adventure, a continuation of the Mega Drive greats. But in this modern age, is this enough mania for us? Now let's travel back to the future. Now, even though this is set after the last Mega Drive outing of Sonic and Knuckles, it still plays, looks and feels like a spiritual successor to those games. It almost feels like the missing Saturn game we never got, and that is right down to the game's controls, sprawling level design, physics, D-pad only here folks. It features 12 zones split up into the same 2 acts and 1 boss stage. 8 of these are remixed versions from previous games and 4 brand new ones that still feel loyal to the lore. Now some start almost identical and then gradually change, others merely resemble the visual display and take on a far grander route. As before, these incorporate the same fiendish crisscrossing routes, Insta-death falls, pixel-perfect jumps, and blistering signature loop-de-loops. Attacks are the full mix across all three playable characters from later games, with Sonic Fire Dash Pickup or Standard Dash Spin, to Tails Hover and Knuckles Spider-Man style traversal enable many routes through the same levels depending on your chosen hero, and as before, a missed platform can still offer an alternative route through. Visually, it is incredibly authentic to the game's roots, looking like a genuine emulated retro game, and at times you can forget you are playing on a modern console at all. The chosen version here I bought, and all the footage it is taken from, is the Switch version, as it felt like the best place to play, and I have passed a fair few hours of my work travel time this week on this particular game. The 720p screen of the handheld is more than adequate to allow a clean and blur-free rendition of Sonic and Pals on the go, whilst using the filters helps it get closer to a true CRT look, but nothing compares to those cathode tubes. It can improve further and sharper with a 1080p image when plugged into your chosen HD display, which also carries the same 60 FPS of the originals. Pixel constructed art is one that can be fickle for the purists and thus needs a certain care to ensure it looks correct. Now, aside some obvious blurring on the horizontal plane from the upscale, which you can see on the text around the eyes and the checkerboard backdrops, it still looks very good indeed. This need for emulating the retro titles means it uses polygons and textures rather than real hardware sprites and bitmaps, and on top of this the resolution is much lower than what you'd expect, coming in around 427 by 240, which means it does scale to 720 evenly on the height, but it will never do it on the width, and this is where you see some of the minor upscaling artifacts that you can notice, so it is a shame that it is there, but I understand it due to the pixel style that they've gone for. Now, although they have seen fit to add in a plethora of CRT-like filters, with the non or sharp options being the two I would recommend, which does help reduce the impact of the upscale from the art in exchange for faux raster lines. Now, I am truly surprised and slightly saddened to not see a 4.3 aspect ratio added here that would be better suited to its native resolution and most certainly the art it so successfully mimics. But this is a grumble that many others may not have. But if you are watching, guys, an update for this would be much loved by me, and I'm sure quite a few people watching this video also. Now, possibly the most impressive feature of the retro engine is how well it leverages modern rendering methods to push so successfully old school 2D rasterized tricks in a beast such as Sonic, embellished with far more colours to enhance its vibrancy, but still having authentic dithered patterns, faux line scrolling parallax backgrounds, much smoother animation frames, scaling and rotation of sprites in battle that were a rarity on the 16-bit machine, not so on the powerhouse Saturn. A good example of this limitation is here on the Megadrive. You can see as Sonic does the loop, it's a prefixed set of animation sprites jumping between them as he moves at certain points, whereas on the modern machine we get a full vert sprite or texture slapped on that just simply rotates around the movement smoothly as he runs on and moves forward. Now, it's all crammed into a sub 200 meg footprint that can be completely loaded into system RAM with room to spare, so no streaming is required. This of course makes loading as fast as the cartridge you may think it was being played on. Even if far beyond the space they enjoyed, it enables you to be warped between worlds with no delay. The passion and respect the artists have lavished here is remarkable, with it being exactly what a 90s Sonic team would have crafted given the chance, hardware and tools. And as far as modern remakes go, this is a high bar for others and the team to follow. Now, audio is another, if not even better, highlight, with all new tracks sounding much like the Sonic CD tunes, but mixed in a modern twist with the same jazz inspiration of many of the catchy show tunes the Blue Guy used as his personal soundtrack. No longer restricted by the FM Yamaha chip and single channel 8-bit samples, they have crafted modern gems without a gem in sight. All tracks and sounds still come from much higher quality and cleaner synthesized modulation, but played back at sample tracks without the memory and channel limits of yesteryear. The same bass tune and noise are clear, but just lavish with far more layering, instruments and hi-hats. They just sound incredible and really makes me miss some of the creativity we had in game music back then. I have greatly enjoyed this week diving back into an iconic title on modern hardware while comparing how close they have come to the originals. It feels the most accurate and respectful entry in the Sonic saga since the Mega CD, never losing sight of its inspiration or intended goals, merging modern boosts within the same confines of the older games and scope. But as much as this is a highlight of the game, it is also its biggest weakness. Familiarity can breed contempt. Once the honeymoon period has worn off, as impressive, fun and remarkably accurate it all is, considering 99% of it is from recreating the code, art and sounds rather than having any to use from the start, it really works best for those that likely no longer have access to the originals to play or want to recreate the 7th title we never had. This may seem like a cheap jab at a title that has worn its heart on its blue-coated sleeve since announcement, but sequels should always contain approximately 50% of the same formula as before, with the rest taken up with new features and improved current ones. Sonic 2 is the hallmark for this formula. Mania feels closer to Sonic 3 than 2 or Knuckles, which is still high praise indeed, but as an owner of all the Sonic games, I feel they played this rare opportunity to reinvent an icon slightly too safe, and my younger self could almost see Treasure themselves achieving much of this on the base Megadrive of the day, and even the modding homebrew community has achieved some remarkable work on the antique hardware itself that stands up to points in the new game. Adding in a real-time polygon bonus stage from 2 or the rotational from the first would have added to the 2 bonus stage. Even a hidden Mario Kart style Mode 7 racer locked in like the Puyo Puyo title would have been a highlight for me, as would adding in some more playable characters such as Rose or Vector, but this was not to be and I can understand why, even if I cannot shake the feeling of all the things I would have tried or could have done, maybe for the next entry in this 2D revival. This is the best Sonic game you will have played since the 90s, and of that there is absolutely no doubt. Exciting, vibrant and filled with passion for the source material, cheat codes and level selects are still present, although the most famous cheat code in the world should have been used. Even a hidden Puyo Puyo game has much to enjoy across all formats, with the PC version set to launch in 2 weeks. And as the dust settles in the whirlwind that has been whipped up, we have yet to see just what Taxman and Co could really do if the shackles came off. If you enjoy this or anything else that I put together here on the channel and or my website, then you can like and subscribe below, share where appropriate. You can also view more material on my website, and like a few others are already doing, you can also help fund me, because I am completely independent and self-funded, by supporting me on Patreon. I appreciate everyone that does so far, and any pounds or dollars per month you can afford will greatly help me continue my work. Until next time, we'll keep rolling with the retro, and I'll catch you on the next one.